Good morning, everyone. I am John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff_2020, and welcome to a special reading this morning from an article from Executive Intelligence Review, the EIR publication that has got so many great articles about past and present events that published by the LaRouche Pub website, larouchepub.com. And I wanted to start beginning this morning to focus on William Barr in terms of what can we really expect? What can we expect from our Attorney General knowing his history? So, you see on the photograph here, we have four American politicians. Well, on the left is Strom Thurmond, the old South Carolina Dixiecrat. Okay? Do you know how he feels about the superiority of the white race? I think that is clear. And let's see, somebody's saying echo. I hope that is not meaning that there's a audio problem. Please let me know if there's an audio problem on the chat room. I'll fix it right away. Well, Strom Thurmond, the old South Carolina racist, and then next one to his right is, to his left and our right is Joe Biden. Good morning, Joe Biden. And doesn't he look young and happy? And who else looks happy is the next guy, William P. Barr, our current Attorney General. Okay, thanks a lot. And then the next one is Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, the longtime Democratic powerful senator from Vermont. And we know Vermont is, one of the great states of the deep state, the elite attitude of we are the betters, and we therefore should be ruling. And nope, Toto doesn't like that idea. I know, Toto. Well, that's why we're here. We're trying to defeat these guys. Yeah, well, I know it's taking a long time. It's taking a long time. Well, anyway, so I wanted you to start off with this image, which comes from the article that I am going to read in a few moments. Because what does it tell you? It tells you that these are four guys who are all in on the deal. What's the deal? The deal is dope. The deal is dope. It's the dope deal of the century, the dope deal of the millennia. It's the British East India Company coming into America, courtesy of these four Tweedledum, Tweedledee, knucklehead, agents of the elites. And, oh, excuse me a second. All right. Well, Toto really does not like dope dealers. And dope dealers are the agents that are politically taking down our country. So I think Lyndon LaRouche's approach that he expressed so well in his great book, Dope Inc., this book here, is what we should be doing right now. You declare war on drugs, well, you should use your army, you should use your military, you should use everything at your disposal to defeat the enemy, just like a great general will not hold back, but throw everything in the fight. And that's what we haven't done, and that's because we have people like William Barr who are in on the deal, who have been raised for the function of defending the dope deals without ever admitting that they're part of it. But certain courageous people and writers have busted them. And I think this passage I'm going to read here is something we need to keep in mind as we consider the credibility of a William P. Barr and the likelihood that he is going to actually uncover the deep state of which he is a deep, deep part. Let's go to the article here. Well, the actual title is William Barr, The Bush Clique and Their Friends at Dope Inc. by Anton Chaikin. And this is the issue of EIR, Volume 21, Number 42, from October 21st, 1994. Two members of George Bush's covert action team, former U.S. Attorney General William Barr and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, both plunged into Virginia politics this year. Barr was head of the Governor's Commission to abolish parole, proposing to make prison inmates slaves under private corporate control. North was promoted for the U.S. Senate as a law and order candidate. Now, remember, we were just reading last night or the night before about the mongrels of Virginia, how Virginia in particular became a model state for the eugenics idea, that there are people that have better protoplasm than other people. And to get rid of the bad protoplasm, we sterilize, we ostracize, and we sweep them up and put them in mental institutions. And that's what was going on in Virginia. Along with that, the complete denial of the survival of all the Native American people, the tribes, the descendants of Powhatan and the descendants of all the great Indian, leaders and their peoples that lived here for thousands of years. They just want to wipe that whole memory off and turn everybody into either white or colored. That was the Virginia plan. And they did it. So we have a perfect state to try their idea of private prisons, making prison inmates slaves. And who was working for the Governor's Commission in Virginia at that time? Working for the governor of Virginia was William P. Barr in favor of this private prison scheme. So that's very, very consistent with the attitude of elitism that comes along with his background in the first place. Okay, back to the text. Oliver North became world famous in the 1980s as a smuggling manager in the Iran-Contra drug running and gun running affair. William Barr, though little known to the public, is a top lawyer for the same criminal covert action team. He was also Attorney General in the Bush administration, when Lyndon LaRouche, then a political prisoner, submitted 6 volumes of new evidence proving that the government always knew he was innocent, evidence which the Justice Department and the courts refused even to look at. We shall report here on Barr's unusual career protecting the political and financial managers of the world narcotics trade. William P. Barr was born in 1950, but he has certainly been seen before on the world stage. It was no doubt Mr. Barr who, under a different name, appeared in Plato's Gorgias dialogue. That's Gorgias for those of you who don't know much about. I don't know much about Plato either. I mean, I found that he is a very important voice in the division of philosophical views in this world, and one that needs to be encountered. But to go into this dialogue cold without realizing, hey, this is written 3,000 years ago, and it's about politics of that day. But here's the story. It was no doubt Mr. Barr who, under a different name, appeared in Plato's Gorgias dialogue. The character Callicles, an aristocratic thug, arrogantly confronts Socrates on the question of justice. And this is it. This is the question of justice. Remember the show I did about pro domina justitia? Okay? The character Callicles, an aristocratic thug, arrogantly confronts Socrates on the question of justice. Callicles claims that, quote, those who framed the laws are the weaker folk, the majority, and accordingly they frame the laws for themselves and their own advantage, to prevent the stronger from gaining the advantage over them. Seeking an advantage over the many is by convention said to be wrong and shameful, and they call it injustice. But in my view, nature herself makes it plain that it is right for the better to have the advantage over the worse. And both among animals and in entire states and races of mankind, it is plain that right is the advantage of the stronger over the weaker. Callicles asserts that anyone who pursues philosophy, that is, the truth, must be entirely unacquainted with all the accomplishments requisite for a gentleman and a man of distinction, and such a truth-seeker should expect to be falsely accused and put to death. All right, so what is this metaphorical quotation from Plato mean? Well, it means that this aristocratic man challenges the great philosopher Socrates. Socrates is on the side of truth. But the question of justice interferes here. Is justice dependent upon truth? Or is justice something that takes an elite mind to see? We commonly hear people say we're not a democracy, we're a republic, right? Why is that? Well, because nobody trusts the crowd, the mob. The mob rule is something that nobody wants, because it just means everybody for themselves, and it turns into chaos and violence and destruction. That's the image that we have. So nobody wants pure democracy. We want a republic where we have representative democracy. But that republic has got to be transparent, and that transparency has to be open in every sense to the voters to say, you know what, I don't like my representative anymore because he's not telling me the truth. Because what it really comes down to is we as citizens are the custodians of the truth. We're like the chorus in a Shakespeare play. We are the custodians of the truth. We the people. And now we are sitting in the stands in the peanut gallery in the bleachers watching this play between different players in the dope game in the swamp. But in a great since we are the judges, we, the people, when we see an issue that needs our attention, are going to focus on it to preserve our freedoms. So this is what Calicles represents, is that aristocratic attitude that says, the people are just, they write these laws, but these laws are voted on by their representatives in this Congress, which really is just a Mickey Mouse expression of popular will anyway. And what do they know about justice? I mean, I went to school. I studied in London. I studied at Harvard. I went to Princeton. I know all about justice. Don't you think I should be the judge of what is just and not the people generally? Because I'm smarter than them. This is William Barr's attitude through those horn-rimmed glasses looking at you. Now, well, I'm tempted to speculate myself some, but let's get back to the book, to the article. This is about BCCI, remember, the Bank of Crooks and Criminals International, and how important that is. We'll be talking about them tonight when I read from Crimes of Patriots by Jonathan Whitney. This is the biggest money laundering operation ever in the history of the world, and it's all to support the Dope Inc. business. Okay, continuing on page 29. Blocking the BCCI investigation. Executives of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International were indicted in October 1988 on charges they conspired with cocaine traffickers to launder millions of dollars in narcotics profits. 40 U.S. and foreign banks, evidently complicit in the international drug trade, were subpoenaed to produce records before a Tampa, Florida grand jury. A majority of those subpoenaed had earlier been named in EIR's best-selling book, Dope Inc., and here it is again, as among those leading British and allied Wall Street banks in the business of washing dope money. BCCI was further exposed as an instrument for the transactions of Oliver North and his associates, who had been criminally employed by Vice President George Bush in the Iran and Contra operations. But George Bush was elected U.S. President just weeks after the BCCI indictments. In December 1989, Bush ordered the U.S. bombing and invasion of Panama, killing thousands. Panamanian General Manuel Noriega, who knew the dirtiest drug-pushing secrets of BCCI, Bush, and North, was kidnapped and imprisoned in Florida. Under the leadership of Attorney General Richard Thornburgh and William Barr, who was then an official in the Bush Justice Department, the BCCI investigations were stopped. Plea bargains protected the world's top drug bankers and protected President Bush and his criminal employee, North. In exchange for leniency, officials of BCCI agreed to help Bush prosecute General Noriega for alleged drug trafficking. Barr, who had a startling private relationship to BCCI and who had drawn up the spurious legal rationale for the attack on Panama, remember him from Chip Tatum's book, right? He's the guy that goes down there and says, "Hey, Lebowski, where's the money?" Because Lebowski was shrinking his underwear. Hillary Clinton's underwear, I think it was. Or no, it was Hillary that was shrinking. Anyway, Chip Tatum tells the story. And I read his book on my channel, another great book taken down by the powers that be, the powers that should not be, PTSNB, the powers that should not be, at YouTube. Did you see that the president issued, by the way, a red line today? He said if they don't abolish Section 230 of the FCC law, the one that tells them that they can't be sued for violating our constitutional rights, then he's not going to sign the appropriations bill. Wow. So that's good. Bravo, President Trump. In exchange for leniency, officials of BCCI agreed to help Bush prosecute General Noriega for alleged drug trafficking. Now, isn't that clever? That's a William Barr production. Barr, who had a startling private relationship to BCCI and who had drawn up the spurious legal rationale for the attack on Panama, was then appointed U.S. Attorney General. He reached a final settlement of the BCCI case, foreclosing all further investigations of the BCCI-linked drug apparatus. We shall now trace Barr's route to political power, observing his early initiation into the Bush covert action machine. Barr reportedly decided while still a high school student that he would one day be the head of the CIA. He joined the CIA's internship program while he was a Columbia University graduate student in 1971, and went to work full-time for the CIA when he left Columbia in 1973. During his first 2 years with the agency, Barr worked for the Intelligence Directorate in the China Department. He would soon cross paths with George Bush, who went to Beijing in 1974 as Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's liaison chief to the Communist Chinese government. Kissinger, Bush, Barr, Communist Chinese government. How much resonance does that have today? Barr was already in the CIA's legal office in 1976 when Bush became Director of Central Intelligence. Bush promptly brought back assassinations manager Theodore Shackley as Associate Deputy CIA Director for Covert Actions, along with Shackley's deputy, Thomas Clines. Shackley had been the head of the CIA Miami station in the early 1960s following the disastrous invasion of Cuba. Shackley and Clines had assembled the Cuba irregulars who had been trained as assassins and smugglers into a permanent covert action force. Men like Felix Rodriguez had served under Shackley as he ran the opium-growing projects in Laos and the Operation Phoenix mass murder project in Vietnam. This is Anton Chaikin telling it like it is. Bravo, sir. Thank you. Anton Chaikin appears in a number of great YouTube videos, and he's a real expert on JFK. So, among the many, many great people I've been able to get close to through my contacts with Harley Schlanger, one day I do hope to meet Mr. Chaikin and thank him for his great service. Shackley's Cubans had turned up as the 1972 Watergate burglars, paid by George Bush's Texas political machine. Shackley would later serve as George Bush's speechwriter in Bush's campaign against Reagan for the 1980 Republican presidential nomination. When Bush got in as vice president instead, Felix Rodriguez and Oliver North together would supervise the Contras drug running out of George Bush's vice presidential office. William Barr joined this team as it matured under George Bush's hand at the CIA. Barr prepared briefs for Bush's stonewalling responses to congressional probes, led by Senator Frank Church and Representative Otis Pike, that attempted to bring the Bush and Kissinger covert action under the rule of American law. George Bush made one extraordinary change at the agency, which was never publicized beyond the ranks of the intelligence community. Bush committed the United States to share with Great Britain's Secret Service the fruits of U.S. satellite surveillance throughout the world. This action dismayed many in the American service, who had seen traitors such as Kim Philby as the very heart of the British Crown's leadership grouping. But Bush's official intelligence policy change reflected his deep-seated ties to Britain. From his father, Prescott Bush's banking partnership with Averell Harriman in British geopolitical schemes from the 1920s to the 1950s, this Anglo-Bush faction of the intelligence community would soon fashion BCCI into a global criminal instrument. And there's Averell Harriman, the son of E.H. Harriman and Mrs. Harriman, the one who financed Cold Spring Harbor and the Eugenics Record Office, which we've been reading about in Edwin Black's book, The War Against the Weak, all about American attempts to create a master race. Jimmy Carter won the 1976 presidential election and refused Bush's request to stay on as CIA director. Jimmy Carter won the 1976 presidential election and refused Bush's request to stay on as a CIA director. So Bush actually had the nerve to say, "Hey, Jimmy, can I still be the guy?" Barr was one of the many CIA men who left the agency after Bush's departure in 1977. Ted Shackley led the Association of Former Intelligence Officers and corralled these men into a private intelligence clique around George Bush. This is going on, by the way, at the same time that the Safari Club is becoming active in Europe and Africa. On George Bush's recommendation, the 27-year-old Barr was hired in 1977 as a clerk to Federal Circuit Court Judge Malcolm Wilkie. During the 1960s, Wilkie had been general counsel to a copper mining conglomerate operating in Chile under the political management of Prescott Bush's banking partner, Sproul Braden. Salvador Allende became Chile's president and confiscated Braden's huge El Teniente mine. Allende was soon overthrown and murdered in 1973. In 1976, Chilean opposition leader Orlando Letelier had been blown up by a car bomb in Washington, D.C. Though the U.S. media generally blamed the Chilean secret police for the killing, it's well established that then CIA Director George Bush had penetrated the Chilean agency and had squelched all U.S. police investigation into the murder. Barr's new boss, Malcolm Wilkie, later served as George Bush's ambassador to Uruguay and arranged cool-out payments to Chileans who might have fingered Bush's CIA for the Letelier bombing. Later in 1992, Chile's Supreme Court decided that President Bush could be legally ordered to appear in Chile to testify on the role of the CIA in the Letelier case. Chilean generals claimed they have been wrongly blamed for the killing and say that Bush's CIA ordered the 1976 bombing. The U.S. Chief Law Enforcement Officer, Attorney General William Barr, did not respond. But what he did was to hire Malcolm Wilkie as a special prosecutor to intimidate the Democratic Congress in the House Post Office affair. On Judge Wilkie's recommendation, Barr started in October 1978 as an associate of the Washington, D.C. law firm Shaw, Pittman, Potts, and Trowbridge. Barr immediately took up the representation of B.F. Saul II, a Maryland real estate magnate who only a few months earlier had become chairman of B.F. Saul II, I should say, it's Roman numerals II, who had become chairman of Financial General Bankshares. In his later testimony to the Senate hearings on his confirmation for Justice Department posts, Barr revealed that he had represented B.F. Saul beginning November 1978 and in 79, 81, and 82. This was an extraordinarily important stretch of time in his client's life. During this period, Financial General was taken over in stages by BCCI, a London-based bank with Arab and other principal investors tied to Anglo-American intelligence. Saul's Financial General Bank shares changed its name to First American Bank shares and functioned as the Maryland, District of Columbia, and Virginia arm of the British spook bank, BCCI. What did Barr really know about BCCI? A decade later, the worldwide scandal would begin with the British taking regulatory action against BCCI in London. British newspapers called BCCI a front for the CIA. The scandal culminated in the prosecution of the elderly Clark Clifford, who at a certain point replaced Saul as chairman of First American. In America, much of the scandal centered around the secret ownership of First American by the BCCI group of investors, in violation of U.S. banking laws requiring transparency of bank control. William Barr told the Senate that the government could not have prosecuted BCCI earlier because it had not discovered this secret BCCI involvement in First American until a decade after the fact. But to whom was it secret? Had it really been a secret to Attorney General Barr? Regardes magazine of May 1990 quoted Clark Clifford that B.F. Saul had occasion to go to London, maybe more than once. He had occasion to go to the Middle East, the Persian Gulf countries. I remember later on his talking with me, and he said, "I have looked into the reputation particularly of the leader of the group, of His Excellency Sheikh Kamal Adham," that's Adham, the chief of Saudi intelligence, and he said, "It's difficult to recall a time when I've heard such universal commendation for an international businessman. I hear it in London. I've heard the most commendatory comments. I've heard about him in the countries in the Persian Gulf. I've not heard one whisper of criticism about this man." And he said, "I feel perfectly comfortable about this group, headed by this man, coming in and taking over our banks." Attorney William Barr's client during the takeover, B.F. Saul, that is, B.F. Saul is Barr's client during the takeover, tried to put a different spin on the matter. He told Regardes, "I never did go to the Middle East to meet him. I think I met Kamal Adham in Washington once. I don't think I ever met him in London. I met him for 20 minutes. I did not try to make a judgment whether they should own a bank. This was something for the Federal Reserve to do. All I was concerned about was whether this was in the best interest of the shareholders, and I thought it was." Well, isn't that it? I mean, that's the Alan Dulles approach to everything is, I'm just working for my shareholders here, guys, even though, I have to do a little genocide on the side, it's all for the shareholders. This is great writing, and it exposes the idea of William Barr being some type of, truth, justice warrior. He's not. He's a cover-up artist for the drug-dealing British and Wall Street banking industry. Barr told the Senate that he had represented B.F. Saul through March of 1982. By this time, the BCCI takeover of First American was completed. In April 1982, Clifford replaced B.F. Saul as First American's chairman. In May 1982, Barr ceased being a private attorney and joined the White House legal staff, becoming an intimate collaborator of Vice President George Bush's counsel, C. Boyden Gray. Barr was officially back in government at the precise time that the Bush team was consolidating extraordinary power, and the new BCCI arrangement would be useful for their global offensive. On May 14, 1982, Vice President Bush's position as chief of all U.S. covert action was formalized in a secret memorandum signed, quote, for the President by Ronald Reagan's National Security Advisor, William P. Clark, and declassified during the congressional Iran-Contra hearings. The memo explained that, quote, the National Security Decision, Directive 3, Crisis Management, establishes the Special Situation Group, the SSG, chaired by the Vice President, who happens to be Bush, right? The SSG is charged with formulating plans in anticipation of crises. The memo also announced the birth of the Standing Crisis Pre-Planning Group to work as an intelligence gathering agency for Bush and his SSG. This new subordinate group, consisting of representatives of Vice President Bush, national security staff members, the CIA, the military, and the State Department, was to meet periodically in the White House Situation Room. They were to identify any areas of potential crisis and, quote, present plans and policy options to the SSG under Chairman Bush. And they were to provide Bush and his assistants as crises develop alternative plans, actions, options, and coordinated implementation plans to resolve these crises. Finally, the subordinate group was to give Chairman Bush and his assistants recommended security, cover, and media plans that will enhance the likelihood of successful execution. In other words, they're going to use the Mockingbird media to cover their tracks. It was announced that the CPPG would meet for the first time on May 20th, 1982, and that agencies were to provide the name of their CPPG representative to Oliver North of the NSC staff. North would henceforth function under Bush's direction in the smuggling of drugs and weapons. Felix Rodriguez, North's cohort in the massive cocaine smuggling of the Contras, began operating through George Bush's office in August 1982 and appeared in Bush's office no later than March 1983. Barr left the administration in September 1983, returning to Shaw Pittman. 2 years later, the illegal shipment of missiles to the Khomeini regime in Iran was planned officially at an August 8, 1985 meeting of Vice President Bush with the National Security Planning Group in the Residence section of the White House. The work of Bush and his cadres bore fruit in what became known years later as the first transactions of the Iran scandal. The London Financial Times on July 29, 1991 described the way BCCI has become, quote, a magnet for covert operations in the 1980s. BCCI used by Iran to buy U.S. missiles. London branches of BCCI were used to finance the export of U.S. anti-tank missiles to Iran's Revolutionary Guards during Iran's war with Iraq. The export of the TOW missiles, together with other weapons in 1985, was arranged by an Indian-born British arms dealer who figured prominently in the Iran-Gate arms for hostages scandal and was wound up in February of this year. The man at the center of the deal was Mr. Ben Banerjee, a London-based businessman who boasted of his links with Colonel North, the disgraced former White House official at the center of Iran-Gate. Mr. Banerjee died of a heart attack in May 1990. The $18.8 million deal in 1985 was disguised as a shipment of 1,250 lift trucks. Mr. Arthur Lyman, the former chief counsel of the Senate's Iran-Contra Committee, told the Financial Times that Mr. Adnan Khashoggi, the Saudi arms dealer who was one of the main figures in the scandal, made payments from his accounts at BCCI to the, quote, enterprise fund of Oliver North. The story of how Mr. Banerjee arranged for the shipment of arms provides a revealing insight into the way in which BCCI became a magnet for covert operations in the 1980s. A U.S. investigator said BCCI could have been involved in the beginning and the end of the TOW missile transactions. According to the documents, some of the weapons were shipped through Poland, unquote. As a member of the Bush team since 1976, Barr was the first Assistant Attorney General installed in the Justice Department after Bush's 1988 election to the presidency. He was chief of the Office of Legal Counsel. During one late-night session, Barr drafted the brief justifying the kidnapping of Panama's General Noriega. He also supplied legal pretexts for the bombing and invasion of Iraq. Barr further developed the astonishing legal theory, which came to be known as the Thornburg Doctrine, that the FBI could kidnap people in foreign countries, even against those countries' laws and regardless of U.S. obligations under international law. Some congressmen were reportedly angry with Barr for keeping confidential the text of the brief upon which this legal doctrine was based. In May 1990, Barr was elevated to Deputy Attorney General, was in charge of the day-to-day management of the Justice Department. As a Bush insider, Barr gradually took over much of the power of his nominal boss, the discredited Attorney General Thornburg. In August 1991, Thornburg resigned. Barr became acting Attorney General and was soon officially nominated for the post. In his Senate confirmation hearings, Barr was asked by Senator Strom Thurmond, "What are your goals during your tenure as Attorney General?" In reply, Barr first made it clear that an attack on the leadership of the world narcotics trade or any top-down approach to the drug problem was strictly ruled out. Quote, "Obviously, drugs has to continue as a top priority. In my view, it is a long-term struggle. We are talking here about the Cold War. We're not talking about Desert Storm. This problem took decades to come about, and it is going to take decades to cure. But part of my responsibility and my priority will be to keep the pressure on, or so that we continue to make progress." What progress? The money laundering bankers, the covert action drug smugglers, and the corruptors of the security and military services are all untouchable by law enforcement because they are, quote, gentlemen and men of distinction for Barr, as they were for the ancient Calicles. What did Barr have in mind when he told the senators that he would be attacking criminal organizations? It was not the Dope Inc. apparatus which criminally employs and feeds the drugs to America's youth. Rather, Barr would target the street-level criminals. He was crudely hyping up victims of violent crime, speaking of street gangs, many of which are involved in drug trafficking themselves. And I think there are some initiatives we can take in that area. We are focusing more on these kinds of organizations, like the Crips and the Bloods. You may have read about the FBI anti-gang squad that was established in Washington, and I think you will be seeing more of that nationwide. Then there is the problem of career criminals, armed career criminals. We have strong firearms statutes, and we are seeking some additional statutes, and we realize that a very high proportion of violent crime is committed by a very small group, a cohort of hardened criminals, career criminals, and we can use the firearms laws to apprehend these individuals and put them away in federal prison for long periods of time, unquote. That's William Barr on questioning by Strom Thurmond. And final paragraphs under the caption, How the Dope Trade Was Saved. Just before Bush's 1988 election to the presidency, as the Iran-Contra scandals continued to boil, executives of BCCI were indicted for conspiracy to launder millions in cocaine profits. Recently, a former high-level U.S. government official with intimate knowledge of the BCCI case told EIR that the Reagan-Bush-era CIA had initiated the bank's trafficking in drugs and arms. This source said that the CIA had assured BCCI associates that these practices were in accord with U.S. national security. Here was the operation of the Bush Special Situation Executive, briefly thrown into public view with the BCCI indictments. The records of at least 40 banks were subpoenaed in connection with BCCI's drug money laundering, including Bank of America, which helped finance the founding of BCCI's startup company and at one point owned 30% of BCCI. Customs officials scrutinized Bank of America accounts used by people linked to Roberto Alcaino, a Colombian arrested in 1988 on cocaine smuggling charges. Alcaino was named in BCCI indictments as a major trafficker. Executives of BCCI allegedly helped him launder his profits. Other major banks targeted by the federal probe included Marine Midland Bank, since 1978 owned by the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. That, of course, is going to become HSBC. So notorious since the British Opium Wars of the 19th century as a drug bank that the New York State Banking Commission blocked its buyout of Marine Midland. Republic National Bank, the New York City flagship firm of Israeli mafia figure Edmund Safra, S-A-F-R-A, whose banking empire stretches from the eastern Mediterranean to Ibero-America, Spanish America, of course. Bank of Nova Scotia, the Canadian banking giant, which was identified in EIR's Dope Inc. as the institution that opened up the Caribbean as an offshore money laundering center in collusion with the Meyer-Lansky Syndicate. Another Florida bank subpoenaed, Dade Land Bank, was owned by a group of anti-Noriega Panamanians. But these investigations were sabotaged and shut down. And in December 1991, Attorney General Barr announced that BCCI had entered a guilty plea to certain racketeering charges, in return for which the U.S. Justice Department agreed to drop all federal and state charges that might be brought against BCCI entities in the future. In the plea bargain arrangement, BCCI forfeited all of its estimated $550 million assets in the U.S., and there were some minor jail sentences, but the global drug apparatus, which had for a time been publicly challenged, was safe. So, I think we can consider ourselves educated as to William P. Barr's core values, which are those of Plato's Callicles. That we, I went to school, I studied, I went to Oxford, I did all of this, I have goo-poo degrees, but the main thing that you have is you have a admission to the club, to the secret club that George Carlin talks about. And because you are in the club, number one, you can prevent us from ever learning certain facts that would lead to real justice. And number two, you will be supported by those other folks in your club that will declare that, yes, you are the right person to say what justice requires. Anton Chaikin called all of these people criminals, all of these organizations, criminal organizations, and I think we need to get back to calling it that. The idea that national security can trump the welfare of the people of this country is absolutely upside down backwards. You have got to protect the welfare of this country, Mr. President, Mr. Attorney General, by stopping the dope trade. Not by using it to finance more covert operations to take over the world for this imperial aristocracy that you would like to be belonging to. You know, do you guys want to be dukes and barons and earls and princes? And is that what you're really after? You know, and to have a bunch of serfs that you can send into war whenever you want to? You want to go back to the Middle Ages instead of following the path that was laid out for us by our founding fathers to educate the American people to know how to think, how to reason, how to make sound decisions, and how to make sure that our government doesn't get out of control and fall into the hands of these elite criminals. Criminals, I hate to say it, like the Attorney General of the United States. So, Mr. Barr, if you want to make amends, if you want to come back into the community of American citizens who support the Constitution, preserve, protect, and defend, support the goodwill of our country overseas, but enforce our laws to protect our people. You are allowing the youth of America to be taken away from the tradition of citizenship, addicted, dumbed down, turned into pawns on your chessboard. So to overcome that shame, you have a lot of work to do. You know, the LaRouche organization is demanding that President Trump give pardons to Edward Snowden and Julian Assange and let them come here and testify to what they know. Will you do that, Mr. Attorney General? Will you turn on your old buddy Robert Swan Mueller III? You know, the guy who showed up drunk, who couldn't answer the simplest questions, the guy who has been used as another cover-up artist for his entire life. Is this what the sons of our great elites have turned into? Is just a bunch of cover-up artists and frauds? The shame of it. The shame. You should never show your face again unless you are willing to step up to your duty. Throw this national security crap out the window and prosecute crime. Sir. All right, so thanks a lot for being with me for this special reading, special report on the EIR article from October 1994, exposing William Barr for who he really is. And let's keep it in mind and keep his feet to the fire as we attempt to save our republic